Okay, here we are in part 3 of the SimpleX Super build. And it doesn't look like I've gotten very far, but I'm trying to let you guys catch up while I fill in details on how we're working around part shortages, constructing our own coils, for instance. I have, however, drilled the most important hole that you can drill in this receiver, and that is the main tuning dial. And I have constructed the main tuning assembly, which has the Jackson vernier attached to the front, along with the flexible coupler. This assembly here, along with that hole, are certainly the most critical part of the receiver construction. So I've got a couple of pilot holes that I've put in with some self-tapping metal screws just to get the panel on the front. I know in the article they talked about, oh, the toggle switch and the on-off volume control, they'll hold the panel to this thing. But yeah, that doesn't work very well when you're trying to line things up and drill holes. I will get into the panel layout, how we begin to get things spread out here. And I've got some drawings that I'm doing in a drawing package called Canvas. So I will have some scale drawings that you can use for some of this. Talking about parts, how are you doing on parts collection? Have you got your power transformer, your output transformer, and your choke identified yet? And you've ordered your 2 megahertz crystals? These are the HC49s from Mauser or some other eBay vendor. It doesn't really matter. The HC49 crystals are all about the same. They're going to have different capacitances, but remember, we're just using them in a series fashion to make a very simple crystal filter. Keep working on parts. This is part 3. So when you're working with a receiver project like this, that's a old-time tube project from the 50s and early 60s, you really have to look at 2 aspects. First of all, you have to look at the ergonomics and the kind of the art side, and that has to do with the panel and the layout and how you're going to put things on the panel. But really, you have to remember, it's the chassis that rules. The chassis is where things are going to be mounted. That's where you've got various dial parts, you've got potentiometers and other things that have to fit on that chassis. No matter how pretty you think this is going to look, make sure that it actually goes on the chassis. And that, for instance, if you're using this capacitor, make sure that you have it mounted on the chassis, and maybe that knob comes out at a different place than you planned on. You might have to change the capacitor or change your way of thinking on what the panel looks like. These are the things that are going back and forth in your mind. So I like playing with little dolls like this, so you can look at the ergonomics of the panel. I mentioned kind of off the cuff that I'd like to have the regenerative control on the front panel. Well, looking at this, it doesn't look like there's any place where it would go. This is the original plan, kind of out of the book. You'll notice that on the Mark I, everything is well labeled on the front panel, everything looks nice. But on the Mark II that was done in the handbook, there's no markings at all. Kind of like the speed kills idea. Let's just get this thing drilled, let's get the knobs on there and get it into the hands of the youngster. He can figure out which one's the volume control, dymo labels or something on the front. If I did want to bring the regenerative control out the front, it really has to be over in this section. This is the output section. I like where the BFO knob is. And of course the BFO knob is indeed fairly close to the detector stage, which is kind of where we would also have the regen. Probably I'll think about relocating the phone jack, and maybe the knobs need to reduce in size in order to accommodate what I'm trying to do. So maybe we have a control for the BFO and a control for the regen like this. And then up here is the on volume control. You get the idea though. We're playing games and we want the thing to look good, but at the same time it has to be able to fit in the chassis. Now the front dial, it doesn't look like it does in the picture. if I'm going to put the Jackson Brothers vernier in there, it's going to be limited by the chassis itself. So I have the chassis here. That vernier is a certain size. Well, it's got to fit like this. You know, it can't fit in the middle, it can't fit on top. And what's going to position that? Well, what's going to position that is the bracket you make for the variable capacitor. So you don't really know where this is going to be yet. So again, you've got to work out the chassis before you even know where this is going to pop out on the front panel. The next thing I'm going to be doing is getting the main parts attached to the chassis that come through the front panel. I don't really care with this on volume control. He can be anywhere. I don't really care too much with the pre-selector because theoretically I could probably lift this guy up and down on standoffs or washers to make sure he comes out at a point that matches up with the volume control to make it look good. But I am very concerned about the tuning dial. That's number one. These controls can be centered up pretty much in the box any way I want, but that tuning control, he's number one, and he's going to get all of the attention. Let's get the SimpleX Super construction into the blasting mode and start to mount some parts. First, we need to go over how we are going to handle our other three inductors, namely the inductors used for the BFO, around the crystal filter, and for the grid leak detector that we're now making regenerative. So we've completed looking at these coils. It's time to move down to the intermediate frequency coils. L5 I'll call the mixer coil, L6 is the detector coil, and L7 is the BFO coil. To predict the inductance that you need for these coils, you read here and here, right? But the problem is we're no longer at 1700 kilohertz. We're at 2 megahertz. So I would expect both of these values to go down. If you look at the way that this coil is being tuned, we have a 680 picofarad capacitor, a 330, and a 15. So if you add these two capacitances together, and then you take the reciprocals and add them all up, you find out that there's an equivalent capacitance in this BFO coil. And I'm calculating that at 228 picofarads. When we're at 2 megahertz and 228 picofarads, if you work out the resonance formula, it comes out to 27.8 microhenries. So if we get a slug-tuned inductor between 20 and 35, we should be able to handle the BFO. These two coils are both loaded with, it looks like, well, it's certainly no more than 100 in whatever the capacitance is of the plate of the tube. So it's something below 100, and we have another equivalent 100 here. It's going to be around 50 picofarads. So 50 picofarads with 2 megahertz, that's 127 microhenries. So again, we need a coil of 100 to 150 microhenries. Similarly, it looks like we've got something around 50 picofarads here as well, because the 2000 and the 47, it probably goes down to 40, and then we have a little bit of loading here. Yeah, let's call that 50 as well. This is how we estimate the kind of tunable inductor we're going to need to make with our slug-tuned coils. Now, how do we measure inductance? I'm not going to go over that here, but of course you can use an inductance meter, an inductance bridge. You can use the sine wave method, looking for resonance, and then work the formula backwards. Or you could use the square wave method and go for the ringing frequency. You do need to have an inductor that will resonate with a capacitor in this range and with a capacitor in this range, depending on what coil we're trying to build. I estimate that with a slug-tuned coil, it's going to be something between 50 and 80 turns. So I think we have a pretty good handle on the air-wound inductors and the toroid inductors that we're using for the pre-selector and the high frequency oscillator. Now it's time to move on to the inductors that will be used for the BFO and around the crystal filter and the grid leak detector. In case of the Mark II, the grid leak detector is a regenerative detector. They're all single coils on the form. So we're not talking about a complex wind. They're not center tapped. There's no secondary. These are straight ahead inductors we're building. Now if we choose to use shielded coils like IF transformers, like these two 455 kilohertz transformers, when you take them apart you'll see that you have a form, and the form will have a couple of slugs inside. I've removed one of the slugs already. We only need one slug for adjustment. You'll also be taking off a bunch of wire, and the wire looks like this. And you say, oh, it's just some enameled wire. Well, it really isn't. Look very closely. You would see that there are several strands of very fine enamel wire here. Looks like there's at least 5 strands of wire. So this is a poor man's Litz wire. That's something we're going to learn about next. Winding coils at lower frequencies, and 2 megahertz is a low frequency, just like the broadcast band. We're going to have to use different techniques to get decent Q out of the coils. We can't just put that old number 24, number 28 enamel wire on the form and expect to have good Q with a powdered iron core like we were able to achieve with both the toroid or the air wound. So let's look at what solid number 28, let's say, looks like on a form like this. And then we're going to compare it to Litz wire and see what kind of Qs we get. And by studying the schematic, we've estimated what kind of capacitance we're working against these coils to get the 2 megahertz resonance. And it's a medium type of inductance, something where we need to wind 60, 70, or 80 turns, just like we did on the other coils. But this time, the core is what increases the inductance enough to get us down to 2 megahertz. So using the same number 28 wire and winding on a form that works with powdered iron slugs, and I've got the slug pretty much fully into the coil. At 2 megahertz, I'm only achieving, about 25 times 2, a Q of 50. Getting a Q of 40 or 50 with a slug-tuned coil is absolutely fine for what we're doing at 2 megahertz. When you wind a typical coil like this, you're going to see that it works fine in oscillators and in general front-end type work. But if you want to increase the Q, you really have to resort to Litz wire. So let's do the same wind, same number of turns, but do it with a thin Litz wire. Okay, now I have the Litz wire coil. Let's tune this in. I hope it's not that far removed from the other one. Oh no, there it is right there. Okay, it looks like we're around 60 at least. So that's going to give us a Q of 120 with the slug-tuned coil. Well, that's a lot better than what we were getting with that coil that was wound with number 28. Quite an improvement. So there's a lesson to be learned with slug-tuned powdered iron core type inductors using Litz wire rather than solid enameled wire. Even if the solid enameled wire is scramble wound or wound in a pattern that keeps the capacitance low, the Litz wire will always win. And we're at a lower frequency now. We're at 2 megahertz rather than 3.5 or 7 megahertz. And these losses start to become more important. And now you'll see that most low frequency coils are wound with Litz wire to try to get the performance that you can get from toroids or air wound coils in a compact package. So I think this is the method that we can use. Now, that doesn't mean we can't use the ordinary number 28 wire for our coils. It'll certainly work for what we're doing. Remember, these are fairly broad-tuned IF coils. We're getting all our selectivity with the crystal filter, not these coils. Okay, of course these are shielded coils, so I put the can back on the coil with the Litz wire inside. With a shielded coil, you know you're properly hooked up when you touch the coil and you don't get a big change in the Q. You know you've got a grounded coil. So I have grounded the coil to the case of the meter. Also notice that the Q has degraded a little bit. It's down to 60 times 2, or 120. So putting the shield can on the coil has degraded the Q a little bit, as you would expect. It's kind of nice working with toroids. You don't have these kind of effects, but in the real world, anytime you mess with the magnetic field by putting a shield over it, for instance, you're going to affect the Q. It's still a tremendous improvement over using the enameled wire alone, however. Okay, here's 75 turns of number 28, wound on just a typical slug-tuned coil, and I've got the core mostly in. At 2 megahertz, which is our target frequency, we've got 65 picofarads of capacitance. This is in the ballpark of the inductance we're looking for. As you can see, we're only managing, I don't know, about 15 on there, so that would be a Q of 30 for this coil. 75 turns. Let's do the same thing, but let's put some of that Litz wire, let's put some of the Litz wire on there. We'll see what 75 turns of Litz wire look like on the same exact core. So here's the Litz wire I'm using, by the way. It's S1046, which means 10 strands of number 46. And it's very thin. Let's get this in here. Okay, I think I put on around 75 turns. Maybe a little more than the other coil, but wow, I came pretty close, already getting a reading. Okay, I think we can agree this is a lot better. Yeah, it's at least 75. So we're talking about, 150 at least for a Q. Oh, let me double check my drive. Hold on. Okay, that's better. Okay. Yeah, I think that so yeah, 130s, 140s for Q on this, compared to barely getting 20 to 30 on the number 28 wire, which is actually thicker than this wire. That's why all IF transformers, and I'm talking about, ordinary IF transformers like you have in the All-American 5, running at 455 kilohertz, use Litz wire. They all use Litz wire. They're not going to use solid enameled wire. And the 2 megahertz is certainly benefiting from the Litz wire. So keep that in the back of your mind. Will it make a difference with this simple receiver build? Probably not, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind when you're winding inductors. So some of you may be familiar with one of the most basic ways to measure inductance, or see if your coil is resonant in the band with the capacity that is available. And that's to simply put a capacitor across the coil in a parallel resonant circuit, feed it with some impedance that you think the circuit will have. In this case, I got a 22K feed resistor. I'm coming out of the generator, so I can tune the generator across the 2 megahertz range and see over here on the scope if it peaks up. So let me just tune the generator quickly. Okay, and on the scale I am reading 2.25 megahertz. We are in the band. Okay, so the next thing I would do is just simply tune the coil, right? And I put a little wire nut on there as a tuning dial. Let's put the slug in further. I think I put 70 turns on this coil. Let's see if we can get the peak. Okay, looking at a peak here. And look at the dial, and it's 2.0. Look at that. Okay, so we estimated this coil probably would add a few more turns. This is a smaller coil form than those bigger ones, so I might up it to, say, 80 or 85 turns. And this represents the 2 coils that are used up top for the detector for the mixer. So say 80-85 turns on this small form. And then for handling the BFO, it will be fewer turns. We'll probably be closer to 50 turns. Okay, in part 4, we're going to complete our part selection and we're going to begin to mount parts on the chassis. Finally, this receiver is going to start to look like a real project. I hope you've been enjoying this classic Novice Receiver construction project, and we're ready to move into the final phase.